Some people measure their lives in years. Dorothy Callahan measured hers in shifts. Night shifts, specifically, the kind that began when the rest of the world was winding down, when husbands were loosening their ties and children were finishing homework and families were gathering around dinner tables, lit by warm kitchen light. For 43 years, Dorothy had pulled on her white nursing shoes at precisely 4:30 in the afternoon, checked her reflection in the hallway mirror without quite meeting her own eyes, and driven through the softening evening light toward County Memorial Hospital, where she would spend the next 12 hours tending to people whose bodies had failed them in ways both predictable and devastating. She had been a good nurse, not just competent, though she was certainly that, but genuinely, deeply good at the work of caring for human beings in their most vulnerable moments. The other nurses asked for her when a patient was dying, when a family needed someone to explain what was happening with both honesty and tenderness, when the overnight hours stretched long and dark and someone needed to sit beside a bed and simply be present. Dorothy understood presence. She had built her entire life around it, had made an art form of showing up when no one else would, of being steady and available and warm in circumstances that would have broken most people. Dorothy had done all of this while married to Richard Callahan for 38 years. The marriage had begun the way marriages often do in small southern towns, with promise, with a white dress Dorothy's mother had sewn by hand, with a reception in the church basement where Richard's construction buddies had gotten drunk on cheap beer, and Dorothy's nursing school friends had danced until their feet ached. Richard had been handsome then, in a broad-shouldered, confident way that Dorothy had mistaken for strength. He had a deep voice and large hands, and the kind of certainty about everything, from politics to breakfast cereal, that can feel reassuring when you are 23 years old and the world seems enormous and uncertain. He had told Dorothy that he would take care of her, that she would never have to worry, that together they would build something solid and lasting. And Dorothy, who had grown up watching her own mother struggle alone after her father left, had believed him with the desperate, grateful belief of someone who has been offered exactly what they most need to hear. They had raised 2 children together, though Dorothy often felt that she had raised them alone. Sarah had come first, then Michael 2 years later, and the daily work of parenthood, the feedings at 2 in the morning, the stomach flu at midnight, the homework supervision, the school plays and soccer games and birthday parties that required weeks of planning had fallen almost entirely to Dorothy. She managed it between her shifts with a precision that bordered on superhuman, sleeping in fragmented 3-hour blocks, eating meals standing up at the kitchen counter, learning to function on a level of exhaustion that would have hospitalized most people. Richard provided the house, the money, the stability that came from a growing construction business. He provided the life, as he liked to say, with a tone that suggested Dorothy should be grateful for the container he had built around her existence. But Dorothy had provided everything that made that container livable. The love, the warmth, the endless patience that turns walls and a roof into something resembling a home. She had provided the invisible labor that holds families together, the kind of work that is noticed only in its absence, the kind of work that history has never found a way to properly compensate. They had not fought much, Dorothy and Richard. Fighting required a kind of mutual engagement that their marriage had gradually lost, the way a river loses water in a drought, not all at once, but slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you look down and realize the riverbed is dry. Richard had traveled for work frequently in the early years, had spent evenings at the office or at job sites, had gradually constructed a world that operated independently of Dorothy's existence. She had noticed the withdrawal the way a nurse notices a patient's slow decline, the cooling of his hand when she reached for it, the way his eyes drifted to his phone when she spoke about her day, the gradual elimination of the small intimacies that had once defined their relationship. He stopped asking about her shifts. He stopped noticing when she changed her hair. He stopped saying her name in the particular way he had said it when they were young, when the syllables still carried weight and warmth and wanting. Dorothy had noticed all of this with the careful, trained observation of someone whose profession required reading the subtle signs of deterioration, but she had not complained. Complaining was not something Dorothy did. She simply adjusted, adapted, continued, the way she had always continued, the way nurses continue through the darkest hours of the night when every cell in their body is screaming for rest. And then, on a Tuesday evening in October, when Dorothy came home from the hospital, still carrying the particular exhaustion of a shift that had included 2 deaths and a cardiac arrest, Richard was sitting in the living room in his best navy shirt, his expensive gold watch catching the lamplight. He had arranged himself on the leather chair, his chair, the one Dorothy was never invited to sit in, with the careful posture of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say. He had waited until she had removed her shoes, until she had set down her purse, until she was standing in the doorway of the room she had cleaned and maintained and made beautiful for 38 years. Then he had told her, in the same measured tone he used when discussing building permits and zoning regulations, that he had found someone else. Her name was Veronica. She was 41. She was his administrative assistant. He had found something with her that he had lost with Dorothy a long time ago: excitement, passion, the feeling of being alive. He was sorry, but this was his decision. This was his time now, his time to live. The children were grown. Sarah had her own family now, and Michael was finishing college. There was nothing holding him here anymore. Nothing that required his continued presence in this particular life, in this particular house, with this particular woman who had given him everything, and whose everything, it turned out, was not enough. Dorothy had stood in the doorway and said nothing. She had not cried. She had not shouted. She had not thrown anything or made threats or collapsed onto the floor the way women do in movies about divorce. She had simply stood there in her nursing scrubs that still smelled faintly of antiseptic and human suffering, and she had looked at the man she had shared a bed with for 38 years, and she had understood with a clarity that was almost physical that he had never really seen her. Not once. Not in all those decades. She had been a function in his life, a caretaker, a cook, a presence that kept the house running and the children alive, but she had never been a person to him, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that would have made leaving her feel like losing something irreplaceable. She was replaceable. She had always been replaceable. That was what Richard was telling her, standing there in his best shirt with his rehearsed speech and his expensive watch. She was a position that could be filled by someone younger, someone more exciting, someone who made him feel the way Dorothy had once made him feel, before the years and the shifts and the invisible labor had worn her into something he no longer recognized as desirable. The divorce had been efficient and brutal, the way Richard did everything, with maximum force and minimum sentiment. He had money. He had lawyers. He had the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of getting exactly what you want and interpreting every acquisition as evidence of your own superiority. Dorothy had her nursing pension, which was modest, and the family home, which Richard's lawyers argued should be sold and the proceeds divided. Dorothy had fought for something. She could not quite remember what now, months later, only that she had wanted to fight, had wanted to resist, had wanted to make him work for the dissolution of everything she had built. But fighting Richard was like fighting the weather. He was relentless and impersonal, and in the end, Dorothy had accepted what his lawyers offered because the alternative was spending years in court with money she did not have, fighting a man who would never concede anything willingly. Richard's lawyer had offered her, among other small concessions, a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina that had been in the Callahan family for generations, but which nobody wanted anymore. The structure was condemned. The county had declared it uninhabitable years ago. It sat on a few acres of mountain land that was too steep and too remote to develop, and the cabin itself was fallen apart, rotting back into the earth from which it had been built. Richard had laughed when his lawyer mentioned it during the settlement meeting, a genuine laugh, the kind Dorothy had not heard from him in years, the kind that comes from finding something deeply, darkly amusing. A condemned cabin for a rejected wife, a pile of rotting wood for a woman he was discarding. Dorothy had signed the papers accepting it because it was all that seemed to be left, and because she was too exhausted to fight anymore, and because somewhere beneath the exhaustion was a small, quiet voice that said, "Take it. Take what they give you. You never know." The months after the divorce were darker than any night shift Dorothy had ever worked. At least during the shifts there had been purpose, a reason to be awake, a reason to keep moving, a reason to function through the exhaustion and the grief that is inseparable from nursing. Patients needed her. Families needed her. The hospital needed her steady hands and her steady voice and her steady, unwavering willingness to show up. But now, at 72 years old, living alone in a rented apartment that smelled of other people's cooking and other people's lives, Dorothy had no one who needed her. The realization was devastating in a way she had not anticipated. She had spent her entire adult life being needed, by patients, by children, by a husband who needed her to maintain his home and his comfort and his illusion of a functioning family. And now, in the sudden absence of need, Dorothy discovered that she had no idea who she was when no one was asking anything of her. The apartment was on the second floor of a converted house in a neighborhood that had once been charming but was now simply tired. The landlord was a distracted man who forgot to fix things and apologized without meaning it. The walls were thin enough that Dorothy could hear the couple downstairs arguing about money every Tuesday and Thursday, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost musical in its predictability. The kitchen was small and poorly lit, with a window that looked out onto a dumpster in the alley below. Dorothy had brought with her one suitcase, a brown leather case with brass clasps that had been her mother's, the only inheritance she had received from a woman who had died with nothing but dignity, and a daughter who loved her. The suitcase held photographs mostly, pictures of Sarah and Michael as children, her nursing school graduation photo, a few letters her mother had written during Dorothy's first year at the hospital, full of encouragement and practical advice, and the kind of fierce, protective love that Dorothy now understood she had been trying to replicate her entire life. The suitcase also held her nursing pins, her retirement certificate, a few items of jewelry that had no monetary value, but that she could not bear to leave behind. It was, in its entirety, the material evidence of a life that had been lived in service to others, and the smallness of it, the way everything she had accumulated in 72 years, fit into a single aging suitcase, made Dorothy feel not sad exactly, but transparent, as if she were slowly becoming invisible to the physical world. She did not sleep well in the apartment. Her body, trained by 43 years of night shifts, still woke at 3 in the morning with the certainty that she should be somewhere, doing something, caring for someone. She would lie in the narrow bed and listen to the sounds of the building settling around her. The creak of old wood, the hum of pipes, the distant siren that might have been an ambulance heading to the hospital where she had spent more hours than she had spent in her own home. She thought about Richard in those dark hours, not with anger exactly, though anger was certainly there, banked like coals beneath a surface of calm. She thought about him with a kind of bewildered grief, the way you might think about a building you had maintained for decades that someone had demolished while you were sleeping. All that work, all that care, all those years of patching and painting, and holding things together with nothing but willpower and love. Gone. Reduced to rubble by a man who had decided that his happiness mattered more than hers, more than their history, more than the 38 years of accumulated life that Dorothy had believed, foolishly it now seemed, were shared. But careful wasn't enough to fill the hours. Dorothy was careful by nature, careful by training, careful by decades of handling medications where a decimal point in the wrong place could kill someone. She was careful with her pension, stretching it across rent and groceries and the small necessities of a life lived alone. She was careful with her emotions, keeping them contained and organized the way she had kept her medication carts organized. Everything in its proper place, everything labeled and accounted for. But careful wasn't enough to stop the loneliness from seeping in through the thin walls and the poorly sealed windows, and the silence that filled the apartment like water filling a sinking ship. The loneliness was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It simply accumulated day by day, hour by hour, until Dorothy realized one morning that she had not spoken to another human being in 4 days, and that the sound of her own voice, when she finally used it to order coffee at the shop on the corner, sounded foreign to her, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. She thought about Helen sometimes, Richard's mother. Helen Callahan had been a different kind of woman, quiet, observant, possessed of a sharpness that she disguised as gentleness. Helen had married into the Callahan family the way Dorothy had, believing in the promise of partnership, believing that love and loyalty would be rewarded with love and loyalty in return. But Helen had learned earlier than Dorothy that the Callahan men took what they wanted and gave back only what they could not avoid giving. Helen's husband, Richard's father, had been the same kind of man, charming on the surface, cold beneath. Helen had survived him through a combination of patience and intelligence, had outlived him by 20 years, had watched her son become a carbon copy of his father, with the resigned acceptance of someone who understood that some patterns repeat across generations, like a curse written into the family's blood. Helen had died 7 years ago. Dorothy had been there at the hospital, had, in fact, been the one to sit with Helen in her final hours, because Richard had been at a job site and could not be reached, or would not come, or both. Helen had been lucid near the end, the morphine keeping the pain at bay while leaving her mind strangely clear. The way a candle sometimes burns brightest just before it goes out. She had held Dorothy's hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for a woman whose body was failing, and she had looked at Dorothy with eyes that seemed to see not just the present, but something further ahead. something that had not yet happened, but that Helen could somehow perceive. "The cabin remembers everything, dear," Helen had whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping of the monitors. "Don't let 'em tear it down." Dorothy had assumed it was the medication talking. People said strange things at the end. She had heard thousands of last words in her career, and most of them were fragments, half sentences, names of people long dead, requests that made no sense outside the private geography of a dying mind. She had squeezed Helen's hand and told her not to worry, that everything would be taken care of, that she could rest now. Helen had closed her eyes, and within the hour, she was gone. Dorothy had noted the time of death on the chart, had called Richard's phone one more time, and gotten voicemail, had sat alone in the room with Helen's body for several minutes before the orderlies came, simply being present with the woman who had been kind to her when no one else in the Callahan family had bothered. Now, 7 years later, sitting in her small apartment with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she stared at nothing, Dorothy heard Helen's words again. Not as a memory exactly, but as a voice, clear and purposeful and urgent in a way that made the hair on the back of Dorothy's neck stand up. "The cabin remembers everything. Don't let them tear it down." Helen had not been confused. Helen had not been speaking randomly. Helen had been trying to tell Dorothy something specific, something important, something that 7 years of grief and distance and the noise of daily living had prevented Dorothy from hearing properly. Helen had been leaving her a message, and Dorothy, trained by 43 years of nursing to listen carefully to what patients were telling her, to hear the words beneath the words, the meaning beneath the surface, finally belatedly understood that she needed to listen now. It took Dorothy 3 weeks to work up the courage to drive to the cabin, 3 weeks of turning Helen's words over in her mind like a stone in her palm, examining them from every angle, trying to determine whether she was hearing what she wanted to hear or what was actually there. She was a practical woman. She did not believe in signs or omens or messages from the dead. She believed in what she could see and touch and verify, vital signs, lab results, the tangible evidence of the physical world. But she also believed in Helen. She believed that Helen had been a woman of purpose, that Helen had not wasted words, that Helen, who had watched Dorothy sacrifice her youth and her dreams and her sleep for a family that did not appreciate her, had tried, in her final moments, to give Dorothy something, and Dorothy owed it to Helen and to herself to find out what that something was. She packed her mother's brown leather suitcase with a change of clothes, her toiletries, a flashlight, a bottle of water, and the kind of practical first aid supplies that a lifetime of nursing had taught her to always carry. She left the apartment on a gray morning in late April, locking the door behind her with the knowledge that nothing inside was worth protecting, but going through the motions anyway. Because motions were all she had left, she drove south and west, following roads that grew narrower and more winding as the suburbs fell away, and the landscape opened into something wilder and more honest. The Blue Ridge Mountains appeared gradually, first as a blue-gray suggestion on the horizon, then as a physical reality that grew larger and more insistent with every mile. The trees were new green with spring, that particular shade of almost yellow-green that lasts only a week or two, before deepening into the darker greens of summer. There was mist in the valleys, thick and white, filling the low places between the mountains like cotton packed into a wound. Dorothy smiled at herself for the nursing metaphor, the professional habit of seeing everything through the lens of care and healing. She stopped twice on the drive to rest. She was 72, and 6 hours behind the wheel was more than her body wanted to endure without protest. Her knees ached from the constant position, and her lower back sent sharp messages of displeasure every time she shifted in the seat. At a gas station halfway through the journey, she bought a sandwich she did not really want and ate it standing beside her car, watching the mountains grow closer, feeling the air change as the altitude increased, cooler, thinner, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth and something else, something green and alive that she could not name, but that made her chest feel lighter than it had in months. The cabin appeared around a bend in a narrow mountain road, set back from the gravel shoulder, behind a tangle of overgrown vegetation so dense that Dorothy almost missed it. She pulled the car to the side of the road and sat for a long moment, her hands still on the steering wheel, looking at what Richard had given her in exchange for 38 years of marriage. It was worse than she had imagined. The structure was actively dying. Not in the dramatic way of a building that has been damaged by fire or storm, but in the slow, patient way of organic material returning to the earth from which it came. The wooden siding had gone gray with age and weather. The paint that had once covered it, now reduced to a few stubborn patches of white that clung to the wood like memories that refused to fade completely. The porch sagged in the middle, a concave curve that suggested the support beams beneath had long since rotted through. Windows were broken or boarded over with plywood that had itself begun to decompose. Kudzu had claimed the eastern wall entirely, its thick vines pulling at the structure with the slow, inexorable patience of nature, reclaiming what belongs to it. Wild ivy covered the rest, threading through gaps in the siding, curling around the porch railings, reaching toward the roof as if trying to pull the entire building down into the embrace of the forest floor. A weathered paper notice was nailed to the front door. Condemned, it read, in official lettering that seemed both unnecessary and cruel, like putting a tag on a dying patient that said terminal. Dorothy got out of the car. The air hit her immediately, mountain air, pine-scented, cool even in late April, carrying the dampness of the mist that still clung to the lower slopes. She could hear birds she could not identify, their calls echoing between the trees in a language she did not speak but found comforting nonetheless. She retrieved her suitcase from the trunk. She was not sure why she had brought it, except that it felt wrong to arrive anywhere without it. As if the suitcase were a part of her identity now, an extension of the woman she had become. And she walked toward the cabin with the measured steps of someone approaching a patient's room for the first time, not knowing what she would find inside but prepared for anything. The porch groaned beneath her weight. Each step produced a sound that was part creak and part warning, the wood protesting against the indignity of being asked to support anything after years of neglect. Dorothy tested each board carefully before putting her full weight on it, the way she might test the strength of a patient's grip, reading the structural integrity through her feet, the way she had once read vital signs through her fingertips. The front door was swollen with moisture and warped in its frame, and Dorothy had to lean her shoulder into it and push with more force than she expected to need. When it finally gave way, the sound it made was like a sigh, a long, slow exhalation, as if the cabin had been holding its breath for years and was finally, reluctantly, letting someone in. The smell that met her was complex and layered. Old wood, dust that had accumulated over years into something almost solid, the particular dampness of a structure that has lost the battle against moisture, the faint mineral smell of stone and earth. Dorothy stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust to the dimness. The cabin was a single main room, larger than she had expected, with a stone fireplace dominating the far wall, a small kitchen area along one side, and what appeared to have been a sleeping area in one corner where a partial dividing wall had partially collapsed. Everything was covered in dust, so thick it looked like gray velvet, soft and undisturbed, a record of years passing without human presence. Sunlight came through the broken windows in sharp geometric beams, illuminating the dust particles that floated in the still air like tiny planets orbiting in their own small universe. The floor was the most damaged part of the structure. The boards were warped and cracked and separated, with visible gaps between them through which Dorothy could see darkness, the crawl space beneath the cabin, that hidden geography that exists beneath all buildings, but that most people never think about. Several boards had rotted through entirely, creating holes the size of dinner plates through which cold air rose from below, carrying with it a smell that was different from the rest of the cabin, wetter, more mineral, almost metallic. Dorothy noted this smell the way she would note an unusual symptom in a patient, filing it away for later consideration, adding it to the growing collection of observations that her trained mind was automatically cataloging. She set her suitcase down carefully by the door and moved into the room with the cautious, deliberate steps of someone walking through a place that might give way at any moment. The floor complained with every step, the old boards flexing and groaning beneath even her modest weight. She moved toward the fireplace, which was the most solid-looking structure in the room. The chimney was made of stacked stone, hand-cut and carefully fitted, the work of someone who understood that a fireplace needed to outlast the building it heated. The hearth was a large slab of slate, dark gray and cool to the touch. When Dorothy knelt down and placed her palm against it, the surface was surprisingly smooth in one area, worn down by what must have been years of hands touching the same spot, the way a prayer stone is worn smooth by generations of faithful fingers. Helen's hands had touched this stone. Dorothy was certain of it. Helen had knelt here, in this exact position, and had placed her hands on this exact spot, many times, over many years. Dorothy's eyes moved from the hearth to the floorboards directly in front of the fireplace, and here she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. The boards in this section were different from the rest of the floor. Not obviously different. You would have to know to look. Would have to have the kind of trained eye that comes from decades of noticing small things that other people miss. But Dorothy noticed. Several of the boards had been pried up and replaced. The replacement boards were slightly newer than the originals, their grain running at a subtly different angle, their color a shade lighter, even through the accumulated dust. The nails securing them were different too, newer, less corroded, driven in with the careful precision of someone who wanted the work to be invisible but could not quite achieve perfection. Someone had removed these boards, had accessed the space beneath them, and had put them back, and that someone, Dorothy knew with absolute certainty, had been Helen. Dorothy found the fireplace poker in the corner of the cabin, resting against the wall where someone had left it perhaps a decade ago, perhaps longer. It was iron, solid and heavy, its handle worn smooth by use. She carried it back to the hearth and knelt again, this time with purpose, with the focused intensity she had brought to every procedure she had ever performed, every IV she had started, every wound she had dressed, every life she had fought to save. She worked the flat end of the poker beneath the edge of the nearest replacement board and applied careful, steady pressure. The board resisted for a moment, the nails gripping the joists beneath with the stubbornness of metal driven into wood, and then it released with a sound like a small gasp, coming free in one piece, revealing darkness beneath. The smell that rose from below was stronger now, mineral, damp, alive in a way that was different from anything Dorothy had experienced. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of underground water, of stone that has been wet for centuries, of minerals dissolved in liquid that has traveled through layers of mountain rock, picking up the chemical signatures of the earth itself. Dorothy had smelled something like it once before, years ago, when she and the nursing staff had taken a weekend trip to a natural hot springs resort. The water there had smelled of sulfur and minerals, and the staff had explained that the therapeutic properties of the water came from its journey through underground rock formations, where it absorbed elements that had healing properties. This smell was similar but different, less sulfurous, more clean, with an almost sweet undertone that suggested different mineral content. She pried up another board, then another, then another. Each one came free more easily than the last, as if the cabin were cooperating with her, as if Helen had designed the replacement boards to be removable by someone who knew where to look and had the determination to look there. The space beneath the floorboards was deeper than Dorothy had expected, not a typical crawl space of a foot or two, but a full 3 feet of open air between the floor joists and the earth below. And in that space, illuminated by the sunlight now streaming through the gaps Dorothy had created, she could see something that made her stop working and simply stare. There were packages, wrapped in heavy-duty plastic sheeting and then in canvas, secured with waterproof tape that had yellowed with age but still held firm. 6 packages of varying sizes, arranged carefully on a wooden platform that someone had built specifically to keep them elevated above the ground, above the moisture, above the water that Dorothy could now see gleaming in the darkness below the platform. A thin sheet of liquid that covered the earth beneath the cabin like a mirror, reflecting the light from above in wavering patterns. Water. There was water down here. Not standing water from rain or flooding, but moving water. She could see it, barely perceptible, a slow current flowing from somewhere beneath the mountain, emerging through the earth beneath the cabin and continuing its ancient journey through rock and soil toward wherever underground rivers go when they leave the places where humans have built their impermanent structures above them. Dorothy lowered herself carefully through the opening in the floor, her feet finding the wooden platform that Helen had built, her hands gripping the floor joists for balance. The air down here was cooler than above, saturated with moisture, and the mineral smell was intense, not overwhelming but present in every breath, filling her lungs with the scent of deep earth and ancient water. She could hear the spring now, a quiet, continuous sound, barely louder than breathing, the sound of water finding its way through stone, emerging into this dark space beneath a condemned cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains, continuing a journey that had begun perhaps thousands of years ago in the geological formations deep beneath the surface. The water was clear. Even in the limited light, Dorothy could see that it was extraordinarily clear, almost luminous, catching the light from above and transforming it into something that seemed to glow from within. She turned her attention to the packages. The nearest one was the largest, perhaps the size of a briefcase, and when Dorothy unwrapped the plastic and canvas covering with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the growing awareness that she was discovering something that Helen had spent years preparing for her to find, she found documents, stacks of them, carefully organized in labeled folders, sealed in additional plastic bags to protect against moisture. The folders were labeled in Helen's handwriting, precise, elegant handwriting that Dorothy recognized immediately, the handwriting of a woman who had been educated in an era when penmanship was considered a reflection of character. Dorothy carried the first folder up through the opening in the floor and sat on the dusty hearth in a beam of afternoon sunlight. The light was golden now, the sun having shifted to the west, coming through the broken windows at an angle that made the dust motes look like flecks of gold suspended in amber. She opened the folder with the reverence of someone opening a letter from a person they loved, and she began to read. The first documents were geological survey reports dated 32 years ago. They had been conducted by a firm called Appalachian Geological Associates, and they were thorough, professional, detailed in the way that scientific documents are detailed: precise measurements, chemical analyses, stratigraphic profiles, hydrological assessments. Dorothy did not understand all of the technical language, but she understood enough. The reports described what they called the Callahan Spring Formation, a natural underground aquifer that fed a spring emerging directly beneath the cabin property. The spring water had been tested extensively, and the results were remarkable. The water contained unusually high concentrations of naturally occurring lithium, a mineral that Dorothy, as a nurse, knew had significant medical applications, particularly in the treatment of mood disorders and neurological conditions. But the lithium was only part of it. The water also contained elevated levels of magnesium, potassium, calcium, and several trace minerals that the reports noted were similar in composition to famous therapeutic spring waters in Europe, the kind of mineral water that people paid enormous sums to access, that had been used medicinally for centuries, that pharmaceutical and wellness companies were increasingly interested in sourcing from natural formations. The second folder contained correspondence, letters from the geological firm to Helen explaining the significance of their findings, letters from a water quality laboratory confirming the mineral content, letters from Helen to a lawyer, not the Callahan family lawyer, Dorothy noted, but a separate attorney, someone Helen had sought out independently, someone who specialized in mineral rights and water law. The correspondence painted a picture of a woman who had discovered something extraordinary beneath her family's property, and who had, with careful deliberation, kept that discovery secret from everyone, including her own son. Helen had hired the surveyors herself, had paid for the testing herself, had consulted the lawyer herself. She had done all of this quietly, carefully, with the kind of strategic patience that Dorothy now recognized as the defining characteristic of Helen's personality. Helen had been playing a long game, a game that had begun 32 years ago and was only now reaching its conclusion. The third folder was the one that changed everything. Dorothy opened it and found a single document, a deed of mineral and water rights, separate from the property deed of the cabin itself. This was the critical distinction, the legal mechanism that Helen had exploited with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. When the original Callahan property had been surveyed and subdivided in 1923, the mineral and water rights had been established as separate from the surface rights, a common practice in that era, when the subsurface resources of a property were often considered distinct from the land above them. The cabin had been built in 1947 on surface rights that did not include the underground resources. The mineral and water rights had remained separate, transferable, independently of the cabin or the land, a legal entity unto themselves, and Helen had transferred those rights to Dorothy. The deed bore Dorothy's full legal name, Dorothy Louise Callahan, and Helen's signature, witnessed and notarized, dated 12 years ago. Helen had arranged this transfer quietly, through her independent lawyer, without informing Richard or anyone else in the Callahan family. The mineral and water rights to the Callahan Spring Formation, everything beneath the surface of the property, everything that the underground water touched and carried and contained, belonged to Dorothy. had belonged to Dorothy for 12 years, though Dorothy had not known it, had not been meant to know it until the time was right, until the moment came when she would need it most. Dorothy sat on the hearth with the deed in her hands and let the tears come. They fell on the document, darkening the paper in small circles, and she did not try to stop them or wipe them away. She cried for Helen, who had loved her in secret, who had seen her clearly when no one else had bothered to look, who had spent decades building a safety net that Dorothy had not known existed. She cried for herself, for the years she had spent feeling invisible and unvalued, for the nights she had worked while Richard slept, for the children she had raised while Richard traveled, for the marriage she had maintained while Richard planned his escape. She cried for the simple, devastating realization that she had been loved, truly, genuinely, strategically loved, by a woman who had never said the words, but who had expressed that love through the most profound action Dorothy could imagine, the protection of her future. There were more packages beneath the floorboards. Dorothy spent the rest of that afternoon and most of the evening retrieving them, carrying them up through the opening in the floor one by one, laying them out on the dusty hearth like offerings at an altar. One package contained additional geological reports, updated surveys that Helen had commissioned every 5 years, tracking the mineral content of the spring water, confirming that the concentrations remained consistent, that the aquifer showed no signs of depletion, that the resource beneath the cabin was not merely valuable, but sustainable, capable of producing mineral-rich water indefinitely. Another package contained financial projections that Helen had apparently commissioned from an independent consultant, estimates of what the mineral water rights might be worth if properly developed, estimates that made Dorothy's head spin with numbers she had never imagined applying to her own life. The consultant had projected that the mineral water, if harvested and marketed properly, could generate income that would sustain Dorothy for the rest of her life, and well beyond. And there was one final package, smaller than the others, wrapped more carefully, sealed with wax as well as tape. Inside was a letter, Helen's letter, written in that precise, elegant handwriting on cream-colored stationery that smelled faintly of the lavender sachets that Helen had always kept in her dresser drawers. "My dear Dorothy," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the time has come. I have been waiting for this moment, in a way, hoping it would never arrive, hoping that my son would prove me wrong, hoping that the marriage I watched with such complicated feelings would somehow defy the pattern I recognized from my own life. But I have also been preparing for it, because preparation is the only form of love that survives the person who gives it. I have watched you, Dorothy. For all these years, I have watched you work and sacrifice and love without receiving love in return. I have watched you give everything to a family that does not see your value, and I have felt a kind of rage that I could not express without destroying the fragile piece that held everything together. You deserved better than my son. You deserved better than the Callahan family. But you chose this life, and you chose it with grace and dedication. And I wanted to ensure that when the time came, as I always feared it would, you would not be left with nothing. The spring beneath this cabin is extraordinary. I discovered it by accident 40 years ago when a pipe beneath the kitchen burst, and I crawled under the floor to assess the damage. What I found was not a plumbing problem, but a gift. Clean, mineral-rich water flowing from deep within the mountain, emerging through the earth with a consistency and purity that I later learned was extremely rare. I had the water tested, and the results were remarkable. I consulted geologists, hydrologists, lawyers. I learned that the mineral rights to the spring could be separated from the property rights to the cabin, and I spent years ensuring that those rights would end up in the hands of the person I trusted most, you. My son will not understand this. He will be angry. He will feel that I have betrayed him, that I have stolen something that belongs to him. But this spring was never his. It was never anyone's but the mountain's, and now it is yours. I have given it to you because you are the only person I trust to use it wisely, to protect it, to understand that some gifts come with responsibilities as well as rewards. The water beneath this cabin has been flowing for thousands of years, and it will continue to flow long after all of us are gone. It is a living thing, Dorothy, and it deserves a caretaker who understands what it means to tend something with patience and love. That caretaker is you. I am sorry I could not tell you this while I was alive. I was afraid that you would tell Richard, afraid that the information would be used against you, afraid that the careful structure I had built would be dismantled before it could serve its purpose. So I hid it here, in the cabin that I have protected all these years. The cabin I would not let them sell or demolish. The cabin that everyone thought I kept out of sentimentality, when in truth I kept it because it held the most important thing I had to give. Forgive me for the secrecy. Forgive me for making you wait. And please believe me when I tell you that you are worth every moment of the waiting. Dorothy read the letter 3 times. The first time, she read it through tears so thick she could barely see the words. The second time, she read it slowly, carefully, savoring each sentence the way you savor the last pages of a book you do not want to end. The third time, she read it aloud, speaking Helen's words into the empty cabin, hearing them not just with her eyes, but with her whole body, feeling the vibration of each syllable in her chest, letting the words fill the space that had been silent for so long, letting Helen's voice, channeled through Dorothy's, fill the cabin with the sound of love that had been waiting, patient and hidden, for the right moment to be heard. The next morning, Dorothy drove back to town and called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, she called the lawyer whose name appeared in Helen's correspondence, a woman named Catherine Park, who specialized in mineral and water rights and who, when Dorothy explained the situation, went very quiet for a long moment before saying, "Mrs. Callahan, I have been wondering when you would call." Catherine had been Helen's lawyer. Catherine had helped Helen establish the separate mineral rights deed, had helped her navigate the complex legal terrain of water rights and mineral law, had been sworn to secrecy, and had kept that secret for 12 years, waiting for the day when Dorothy would discover what Helen had left behind and would need legal guidance to protect it. The process took several months. Catherine worked methodically, verifying every document, confirming the validity of the mineral rights deed with the county records office, hiring updated geological surveys to confirm that the spring water still contained the same extraordinary mineral content that Helen's original surveys had documented. The results were not just confirmatory, they were even better than expected. 32 years of additional testing had produced more data, and that data showed that the Callahan Spring Formation was one of the highest concentration natural lithium water sources in the eastern United States. The pharmaceutical and wellness industries had been increasingly interested in natural lithium sources, and Catherine began receiving inquiries from companies almost as soon as she discreetly let it be known that mineral water rights might be available for licensing. The offers came in over several weeks, each one larger than the last. Dorothy sat in Catherine's office and listened as the lawyer explained the numbers, the terms, the implications. One company wanted to purchase the rights outright for a sum that made Dorothy physically dizzy, $1.2 million, with additional royalties based on production volume. Another offered a 30-year licensing agreement with guaranteed annual payments that would provide Dorothy with a steady, substantial income for the rest of her life. A third proposed a partnership that would involve Dorothy retaining ownership while the company handled extraction and marketing, with Dorothy receiving a percentage of all revenue generated from the spring water. Catherine recommended the licensing agreement as the best balance of immediate security and long-term income. And Dorothy, after a week of careful consideration, she was, after all, a careful woman, agreed. The initial licensing payment was deposited into Dorothy's account on a Tuesday morning in September. She was sitting in her small apartment, drinking coffee from the same mug she had been using for months, when her phone buzzed with a notification from her bank. She looked at the number on the screen and set the mug down very carefully, as if the world had become fragile and might break if she moved too quickly. The number was not the $1.2 million of the outright purchase offer. That was not what she had chosen, but it was substantial enough to transform her life completely, to pay off any debts, to buy a home, to ensure that she would never again lie awake at 3 in the morning worrying about whether her pension would stretch far enough. She sat very still for a long time, looking at the number, and then she picked up the mug again and finished her coffee, because Dorothy Callahan was a woman who finished what she started, and that included cups of coffee that had gone cold while the world rearranged itself around her. She did not tell Richard immediately. There was no legal obligation to inform him, and Catherine had advised discretion. But Dorothy was not hiding. She was simply taking her time, the way Helen had taken her time, the way the spring water took its time flowing through layers of ancient rock before emerging into the light. Some things require patience. Some revelations are best delivered not in haste, but in the fullness of time, when their weight can be properly appreciated. Richard found out in January, 4 months after the licensing agreement was signed. He found out the way people in small towns always find out, through conversation, through rumor, through the irresistible human need to share remarkable news. Someone had mentioned at a dinner party that the old Callahan cabin property was being developed for mineral water extraction. Someone else had mentioned that the mineral rights belonged not to Richard, but to his ex-wife. The news had traveled through social circles with the efficiency of a virus, reaching Richard over dessert at a restaurant where he was dining with Veronica, the younger woman for whom he had dismantled his marriage. He called Dorothy that evening. His voice was sharp with something that sounded like anger, but might have been fear. The fear of a man who realizes he has made a catastrophic miscalculation, that the thing he discarded as worthless was in fact the most valuable thing he possessed. He demanded to know what had happened. He demanded to see the documents. He demanded that Dorothy explain how his own mother had transferred mineral rights to his ex-wife without his knowledge, without his consent, without so much as a conversation about property that he considered his by birthright. Dorothy listened to Richard's voice, the voice she had listened to for 38 years, the voice that had told her he was leaving, the voice that had laughed when his lawyer gave her the condemned cabin, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not anger, not triumph. Something quieter than either of those, something more like completion. She told Richard calmly and clearly what Catherine had told her. The mineral rights had been legally separated from the surface property in 1923. Helen had legally transferred those rights to Dorothy 12 years ago. The transfer was properly documented, witnessed, notarized, and recorded with the county. There was nothing to contest, nothing to challenge, nothing to undo. The spring, the water, the minerals, the future they represented, all of it belonged to Dorothy. Had always been meant to belong to Dorothy. Helen had made sure of it. Richard had been silent for a long time. Then he had said, his voice different now, smaller, stripped of its usual confidence. "My mother did this. She planned this." "Your mother loved me," Dorothy had said simply. "She saw me when you didn't. She protected me when you wouldn't. And she gave me a future when you took mine away." She had ended the call and had not answered when he called back. She blocked his number, the way she might remove a bandage that was no longer needed, firmly, cleanly, without ceremony. And then she sat in her apartment for the last time, because tomorrow she would begin the process of moving into the house she had purchased, a small cottage 20 miles from the cabin, in a mountain town where the air smelled of pine and the people waved to each other on the street, and nobody knew or cared about the Callahan family drama. She would furnish it the way she wanted, with colors she chose and furniture she liked and flowers in every window. She would live there, in her own space, on her own terms, for the first time in 72 years. On a morning in early spring, exactly 1 year after she had first driven to the cabin, Dorothy returned. She parked her car in the same spot, retrieved the brown leather suitcase from the trunk, not because she needed it, but because it felt right, because the suitcase was part of this story and deserved to be present at its conclusion. And she walked through the overgrown path to the cabin. The structure was still there, still condemned, still slowly returning to the earth. But it was different now. The pharmaceutical company had stabilized it, had reinforced the foundation, had ensured that the cabin would not collapse onto the spring it protected. A small, modern facility had been constructed on the far side of the property, discreet and environmentally designed, where the spring water was harvested and initially processed before being shipped to laboratories for further refinement. The operation was quiet and sustainable, the way Helen would have wanted it, the way Dorothy had insisted it be. Dorothy had replaced the condemned notice on the front door with a small brass plaque. It read, "The Callahan Spring, discovered by Helen Callahan, protected for Dorothy Callahan. Some gifts are hidden in the places everyone else has given up on." She stood on the porch of the cabin, the sagging, creaking porch that had borne her weight a year ago when she arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a dead woman's whispered words, and she listened. She could hear the spring beneath the floor, that quiet, continuous sound of water moving through stone, the sound of something ancient and patient and alive. She could hear the birds in the pines, the wind moving through the mountain gaps, the small sounds of a world that existed long before Dorothy Callahan and would exist long after her. She could smell the minerals in the air, the pine resin, the particular scent of a mountain morning when the mist is just beginning to lift and the light is turning everything golden. Dorothy was 73 years old. She had spent 43 years working night shifts in a hospital, had spent 38 years married to a man who never saw her, and had spent the worst year of her life learning that everything she believed about her own worth had been wrong. Not because she was worthless, but because she had allowed someone else to define her value. Helen had known better. Helen had seen the truth that Dorothy had been unable to see for herself, that Dorothy's worth was not dependent on Richard's recognition of it, that her value was not diminished by his indifference, that she deserved protection and love and a future built on something more solid than a man's willingness to stay. The cabin remembers everything. That is what Helen had said. And she had been right. The cabin remembered the spring beneath its floors, remembered the water that had been flowing for millennia, remembered the documents that Helen had hidden in its darkness, remembered the secret that had waited, patient and faithful, for the woman who would finally come to claim it. The cabin remembered everything. And now, so did Dorothy. She remembered her own strength. She remembered her own value. She remembered that she had been loved, quietly and fiercely, by a woman who understood that the most important gifts are sometimes the ones that are hidden beneath the surface, waiting in darkness and silence for the right moment to change everything. Dorothy set her suitcase down on the porch, sat in the old chair that someone had placed there. Perhaps Helen, years ago. Perhaps the construction crew more recently. And she closed her eyes. The mountain air was cool on her face. The spring murmured beneath the floor. The birds sang in the pines. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Dorothy Callahan felt at peace. Not the exhausted peace of someone who has given up. Not the resigned peace of someone who has accepted less than they deserve, but the genuine earned peace of someone who has survived everything that was meant to break them and has emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken, into a life that is finally, beautifully, entirely their own.